Before the dawn of civilization, how we got food and how we ate as a species was vastly different from today. Before agriculture, humans hunted and gathered in order to eat. There were no grains or dairy. Diets consisted mainly of fruits, meat, and other naturally occurring foods. The problem was that, even in places where foodstuffs were abundant, food sources were heavily dependent on location, weather, etc. And this made such food sources unreliable for Paleolithic humans, especially considering that many tribes were nomadic, and so food wasn't always there. The solution, the one that stood the test of time until now, was agriculture. This allowed populations to settle. They no longer had to hunt or gather food because said foods were farmed. Traditional agriculture, and the type that has been used mostly throughout the ages and predominantly today, is called monoculture. This is where one type of crop is grown continuously on a parcel of land. This makes sense in the context of trade because farmers typically don't grow food to sustain themselves necessarily, but their produce is a commodity to be sold. However, monoculture has a set of problems, big ones, that impact sustainability and food security. We are in a world of global trade, and because of economies of scale, today many crops are specifically grown in one or a few areas of the world to be exported elsewhere. If, for whatever reason, a harvest fails, it could disrupt the entire world supply chain for that crop. Additionally, monoculture harms soil fertility by using up nutrients from the soil without long-term replenishment. A lot of the crops we grow today are nitrogen hungry, and in a commercial setting, this means that nitrate fertilizers need to be sprayed on crops in order for them to grow economically, not to mention the hydrocarbon-powered vehicles required to maintain and harvest these crops. Monoculture also uses a ginormous amount of land. Don't get me wrong, monoculture is very good at producing a lot of food, but is unsustainable in the long run, and much of the food from it actually gets wasted. In fact, 30% of the food produced today goes to waste. Now, there are many alternatives to monoculture that we could explore if we are to become more sustainable in our food production and more equitable in its distribution, and those alternatives are what I'm going to explore in this video. The simplest alternative to monoculture is something called polyculture. This is where two or more crops of different species are grown alongside each other in order to achieve various beneficial things, such as reducing soil erosion, providing natural pest control, and even improving crop yield. This is a type of ecological engineering, and if we take this to its logical extreme, what we have is something else called permaculture. In a permaculture system, natural cycles, systems, and symbioses are used to create a type of agriculture that requires very little maintenance, as natural cycles take care of maintaining crops, deterring pests, and maintaining soil fertility. Monoculture, polyculture, and permaculture are three modes of agriculture, with monoculture being the least sustainable and permaculture being the most. However, these all still rely on similar methods of growing food, that is, using soil as a growth medium that requires a lot of water to maintain. But there are many different agricultural methods that prove more efficient and sustainable, that could produce enough food for many times the current global population. Hydroponics is a method of agriculture whereby crops are grown in nutrient-dense water through a permeable membrane such as cellulose. This method saves a lot of water because all the water the plants will ever need is right beneath them. However, if we want to be even more water efficient, we can opt for aeroponics, where crops are grown in such a way where they are fed a nutrient-dense mist that hydrates them and helps them grow. While hydroponics uses 90% less water than conventional farming, aeroponics uses 25% less water than hydroponics, making aeroponics the most water-efficient method of growing food. A potential downside of aeroponics, however, is that a continuous spray of nutrients is required, which requires more electrical equipment to run. Additionally, while hydroponics might use more water than aeroponics, it's also better at reusing its water, because the water is basically always there under the medium. and so the only water lost is to the plants themselves. An adaptation of hydroponics, something that could serve as both a source of plant-based foods and fish-based protein, and something that works more like a symbiotic system, is something called aquaponics. In aquaponics, what you have is a combined system of hydroponics and aquaculture. These things are all fantastic. They address many of the issues with agriculture, the water use, the need for fertilizers and pesticides, and things like aquaponics, hydroponics, etc. are also known to increase yield. However, there is one very, very big problem we've yet to solve. If there was one scarce resource that was truly scarce, that sans colonizing the stars has inherent scarcity we can't get away from, that resource would be land. And today, agriculture uses a lot of it. In fact, half of the world's habitable land is used for agriculture, with most of that going towards livestock farming. So why is this a problem? Well, in order to keep up with increased demand, agriculture requires an ever-increasing land use. The logical conclusion to this is ecological destruction for the creation of cropland and pasture. We've seen this in more recent times in countries like Brazil, where a lot of the deforestation that's happening there is to provide space for new farmland. As a side note, an important one, conventional open-air monoculture means that a lot of the foodstuffs we use are produced in specific areas of the world in large quantities. This means that many exotic crops are typically grown en masse in their native regions, which, a lot of the time, are areas of the world that are very ecologically vulnerable. So then, how can we feed a population approaching 8 billion better than we do today without wrecking the planet in the process? Well, we clearly need to transition away from how we do agriculture now, but that is going to take a long time, which is kind of a luxury when you're facing multiple imminent ecological crises. And this means that while we do need to create new ways of farming, we also need effective short-term solutions. A couple of these short-term solutions are managed grazing and no-till farming, of which are examples of regenerative agriculture that sequester a lot of carbon and also preserve the health of soils. However, looking medium to long term, in order to take full advantage of sustainable agriculture practices and ensure that food can and does get to everyone, we need to look up. We need to go vertical. If you've only had a cursory acquaintance with the term vertical farming, you probably think of vertical farms as the stacks upon stacks of hydroponically grown lettuce as a stock photo for an article for some tech journal or something. However, as I will deliberate, transitioning to this form of agriculture could be a way for us to feed the world without putting pressure on the planet. In fact, we could use much of the land saved to restore some natural ecosystems. Imagine a 1 acre plot at full productive farming capacity. If this setup was based instead on a 2-story farm, that would mean that the farm now only uses half an acre of land, a quarter of an acre at 4 stories, an eighth at 8, a tenth at 10, etc. Currently, just over 4 billion acres are used today as cropland globally. This accounts for 14% of the total non-icy land area on Earth. If we were to make all crop farms just 1 story higher, we could halve that land use. But why stop at 2 stories when we can go to 6 or 8 without complicating the design too much? The land saved could be used for community spaces, recreation, rewilding and restoring of natural ecosystems, and many other useful things. In addition to saving land, opting for vertical farms means that food can be grown in urban centres and local communities, which reduces food miles and allows more flexible and equitable distribution of food. In addition, if a vertical farm is designed like a greenhouse, it can emulate many climates and conditions, which allows for the growing of many different crops that perhaps could only survive in their native environments. Another plus is scalability, which is something you don't typically hear about when it comes to vertical farming. When you hear about vertical farms being developed, they're often these large-scale facilities placed in the middle of cities, and there's nothing inherently wrong with that. but it ignores the fact that vertical farming can also be employed at a smaller scale, such as in a backyard or community setting. Now, as I alluded to earlier in this video, there are many different types of vertical farming that can be done. A vertical farm can probably most famously employ hydroponics, where things grow in water, aeroponics, where things grow in mist. Aquaponics is often mentioned as well, because if tailored correctly, it can serve as a symbiotic system where, say, if you have a tank of fish with some algae as well for the fish to eat, and then on top of that you have some crops that you're growing, what you could do is you could have a system where the algae gets eaten by the fish then do their business, which produces a lot of nutrients for the crops that you're growing, and then the crops absorb all of this stuff and clean the water for the fish. And this cleaning of the water by the crops above also helps create a cleaner environment for algae to survive and grow, so that the cycle can continue. And this is a very circular and sustainable way of doing things, and it's something which takes advantage of the natural relationships that occur between different life forms. It also reduces maintenance, and in these ways it kind of borrows from the ideas of permaculture. Now, vertical farming does have one major disadvantage, especially if you're talking about conventional vertical farms with artificial lighting. And this disadvantage is that they require more energy to run as a whole than a conventional farm. Now, there are a few ways to deal with this problem. While you could run vertical farms just fine on solar panels, doing so would mean that you would lose quite a lot of the land saved from transitioning away from conventional farming to instead generating solar energy. Something that could prove much more space efficient is to use geothermal energy to power most of the farm, and then use rooftop solar, among other things, for supplemental power. Having this energy mix means that less land needs to be dedicated to solar panels to power vertical farms. But do vertically grown crops necessarily need to use artificial light as their primary light source? The answer actually is no. The reason many vertical farms use artificial light in the first place is because of the lack of sunlight available at lower levels. The thing is, using various techniques, such as reflective tubing, otherwise known as solar tubes, we can actually redirect sunlight to each story of a vertical farm, so that it is able to utilize natural light to a similar effect as it would do on a conventional farm. We would probably still need to use, in this case, some artificial light, but nowhere near as much as we would without sunlight redirection. A similar result can be achieved through the use of things like fibre optic cables as well, which, despite sounding high-tech, are actually just pieces of sleeved plastic or glass that collect and transmit light. Now, as I touched on earlier, vertical farming doesn't have to mean large-scale facilities. It can also mean small-scale projects that happen in the local neighbourhood, people's gardens, etc. Now, there's advantages to going big, and there's also advantages to going small. On a smaller scale setting, it's easier for people to access the food grown from the farm because they can just go and pick from the farm. It's easily accessible, there's more ease of distribution and things like that. However, if you go big and have a large scale vertical farm in the middle of a community, what you can then do is you can automate it. And this means that in a context of a post-scarcity world, you can essentially just remove most human labour from the equation. Not to mention that the larger vertical farms will probably be the most productive and could produce tons of food in a small amount of space. And the last thing I wanted to touch on is that a vertical farm doesn't have to be a new building. It can be a repurposed office building, for example, or maybe a tower block that's been perhaps deemed unfit for human habitation. The point is, you can reuse old buildings as vertical farms to grow food in for the surrounding community. And I think that's a very efficient and sustainable way of going about it. And on that note, while vertical farming may not be the perfect solution to our agriculture problems in everyone's eyes, it certainly would save a lot of land and water, could provide easier and more equitable access to food, and could give some perhaps neglected urban areas a new lease of life. If you enjoyed watching this video, Please make sure to like and share, and if you want to see more from me, click subscribe and check up on me once in a while. Sharing stuff like this helps my channel grow and helps raise awareness of the topics discussed in my content. Anyway, once again, I thank you all for watching. Take care. Bye for now.